In the early hours of a quiet Nairobi morning, as shopkeepers rolled up their metal shutters and children hurried to school with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders, a strange unease hung in the air. Ordinary Kenyans scrolling through their phones froze when one sentence flashed across their screens, a sentence that felt less like politics and more like a storm warning. That ocean belongs to me. And in the future, we are going to have wars. Those words spoken by Uganda's long-serving president Yoweri Museveni cut through East Africa like a cold wind. For older Kenyans who still remember stories of the Uganda-Tanzania clashes of the 1970s, the statement struck a nerve. And for younger Kenyans, it raised only one question. Was this a joke? A metaphor? Or a threat? Before anyone could fully process the shock, something even more unusual happened. As Kenya debated whether Museveni was serious, Ugandan military officers quietly landed at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. No sirens, no announcements, just uniforms stepping into the capital of the very nation their president had warned could be the setting of a future conflict. Kenya's defense forces described the visit as a routine benchmarking exercise. But the timing hours after Museveni's comments about possible wars over access to the Indian Ocean made it impossible for East Africans to ignore the tension. Was this coincidence? Or quiet diplomacy dressed in camouflage? For families in Nairobi, Eldoret, Busia, and Mombasa, the question became even heavier. What does it mean when a president talks of war, yet his army walks calmly into a neighboring capital? As we break down this story, we will look not only at what was said and done, but why it matters for East Africa's future, for regional stability, and for the rising fears of ordinary citizens who simply want peace. If you believe that truth is more important than headlines, stay with me. And if you want to be among the first to truly understand the shifting winds across Africa, please consider subscribing. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Long before the Ugandan officers touched down in Nairobi, the spark of tension had already been lit by one man's words. President Yoweri Museveni, a leader who has ruled Uganda for nearly 4 decades, sat before an interviewer earlier in the week and unleashed a statement that stunned the entire region. With a calm face and a steady voice, he questioned why landlocked nations like Uganda should depend entirely on Kenya for access to the sea, before declaring, "That ocean belongs to me, because it is my ocean. I am entitled to that ocean. In the future, we are going to have wars." For East Africans who understand the fragile balance of regional politics, this was no ordinary slip of the tongue. It was a warning wrapped in frustration, and it struck at one of the most sensitive realities of the region, the geography that determines power. Uganda, like Rwanda, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, relies heavily on Kenya's port of Mombasa for its imports and exports. Whenever Kenya experiences political tension, port delays, or logistical disruptions, Uganda feels it immediately. Museveni's remarks reflected this long-standing frustration, but the manner in which he expressed it, invoking future wars, sent shockwaves across Kenyan media. Online Kenyans reacted with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Some called the remarks reckless, others mocked the idea openly. But many older Kenyans, those who remember the turbulence of East Africa's past, were not amused. Words like these, spoken by a sitting president, carry weight, especially in a region where stability is always hard-earned and easily shaken. What made the situation even more sensitive was the political timing. Uganda is currently in a heated election season. Museveni, seeking what he calls his final term, has increasingly relied on fiery rhetoric to remind his supporters that he alone can defend Uganda's interests. To some, his comments were simply campaign theatrics. To others, they felt like a dangerous escalation at the worst possible moment. And then came the twist. Barely hours after Museveni's interview aired, the Kenya Defense Forces confirmed that a Ugandan military delegation had arrived in Nairobi for an official visit. The trip, which had likely been planned for weeks in advance, suddenly took on a very different meaning. Leading the delegation was Major General Francis Takarwa, the deputy commander of Uganda's land forces, a senior and influential figure in the UPDF. His team began a series of meetings that included a tour of the Moi Air Base closed-door sessions with Kenyan officers and a benchmarking exercise at the Defense Forces Welfare Services. Officially, the purpose was simple: to study how Kenya supports the welfare of its soldiers and their families. But for many observers, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Kenya was still processing Museveni's war-tinged comments when Ugandan officers walked calmly through Nairobi's military corridors. The contrast between the president's words and his army's actions raised more questions than answers. Were these two events unrelated? Was the visit a form of quiet diplomacy meant to calm tensions? Or was it a strategic reminder that Uganda remains fully engaged in regional military cooperation regardless of political rhetoric? Even Kenyan analysts struggled to interpret the moment. Some argued that Museveni was simply speaking metaphorically about regional inequality and infrastructure challenges, not actual war. Others insisted that his choice of language was irresponsible and potentially destabilizing. After all, East Africa is a region where misunderstandings can quickly turn into military standoffs, especially near border towns like Busia and Malaba. In response, Kenya's government eventually broke its silence. Foreign Affairs Principal Secretary Korir Singwe clarified that Museveni's remarks had been taken out of context. He emphasized that Uganda and Kenya share long-standing ties and deep cooperation on many fronts: trade, security, cultural exchange, and cross-border family networks. But even with this attempt at reassurance, the mood in Nairobi remained tense. What no one could deny was that the arrival of the Ugandan military delegation at this exact moment had transformed a simple political remark into a full-blown regional question. How fragile is peace in East Africa when a single sentence can shake an entire region? As the Ugandan officers began their quiet movements across Nairobi, the tension that had been building in the background snapped into full clarity. This was the moment when the story shifted from politics to perception, from statements to symbolism. Nothing heightens anxiety like mixed signals from powerful institutions, a president talking of war and his military shaking hands with the very nation he seemed to warn. The first sign that Kenya was taking the situation seriously came from the atmosphere surrounding the closed-door meetings. They were described by officials as routine, but insiders noted a heightened sense of discretion. The visit's itinerary became less about welfare benchmarking and more about the optics: how it looked to the public, how it felt to the region, and what message it might send to international observers. At Moi Air Base, under a gray Nairobi sky, Ugandan officers were seen walking alongside Kenyan counterparts, escorted through secure hangars and administrative blocks. The images, though not widely released, captured a strange duality: uniformed men exchanging polite gestures, even as their commander-in-chief's words echoed like distant thunder. For many Kenyans, this contradiction became the story's emotional peak. Could these officers truly separate their mission from the political storm their president had created? And was Kenya right to welcome them so openly so soon after such inflammatory remarks? The sense of unease grew stronger when the delegation held a courtesy meeting with the commander of the Kenya Air Force, Major General Bernard Waliaula. Their conversation focused on institutional learning and shared welfare practices, but observers noted the subtext. This was a carefully staged reassurance, a message to East Africa that cooperation had not collapsed. Yet beneath the polished protocol, the air felt heavy, as if both sides were trying to steady a boat in rising tide. Then came the analysts. Political commentators and regional security experts in Kenya began speaking out, highlighting the danger of Museveni's rhetoric. One analyst warned bluntly that for a sitting president to hint at war over access to the ocean was deeply dangerous, especially given Uganda's painful history. He reminded viewers of the 1969 clashes and the infamous 1978 and 79 Kagera war conflicts that not only devastated communities but left Uganda politically and economically weakened. That historical memory still lingers in older East Africans like a scar from an old wound easily reopened by reckless language. Other experts questioned whether Museveni's remarks were truly aimed at Kenya or simply tailored for domestic consumption. Uganda's election season has often been accompanied by bold, even provocative statements. Some believed he was appealing to nationalist sentiments, stirring emotions among voters who feel Uganda is unfairly constrained by geography and dependent on its neighbors' goodwill. Yet, regardless of Museveni's intention, the timing could not have been more volatile. East Africa is a region where small misunderstandings escalate quickly, border disputes become military standoffs, economic frustrations turn political, and political tensions can ignite within days. So when a president mentions future wars, the entire region instinctively stiffens its posture. Meanwhile, Kenyan officials found themselves walking a tightrope. They needed to prevent panic without appearing naive. They needed to maintain cooperation without welcoming provocation. As Kenya's Foreign Affairs Principal Secretary Korir Singwe eventually put it, Museveni's comments were metaphorical, not literal. But even in that reassurance, he chose his words carefully, a reminder that this was no ordinary diplomatic moment. In truth, the real climax of the situation lay not in speeches or statements, but in the visual reality of the moment. Ugandan officers in Nairobi shaking hands calmly after their president had spoken of war. It was a picture that captured the contradictions of modern East Africa, a region striving for unity, yet constantly tested by the ambitions and frustrations of its leaders. For many East Africans, the message was clear: diplomacy still held, but only barely. The wrong word, the wrong reaction, or the wrong assumption could tip everything sideways. For millions of ordinary Kenyans and Ugandans, the drama unfolding between their leaders was more than a diplomatic dispute. It carried real consequences for daily life, trade movement, and the fragile sense of peace that holds East Africa together. In Kenya's border towns of Busia and Malaba, where traders depend on the steady flow of Ugandan trucks and cross-border commerce, Museveni's words landed like a thunderclap. Small shop owners who rely on Ugandan customers began whispering among themselves, wondering whether this was the beginning of a larger rift. Long-distance truck drivers who shuttle goods between Mombasa and Kampala exchanged rumors at roadside cafes. Would customs officials tighten controls? Would traffic slow down? Would fear alone disrupt the rhythm of trade? For older residents who lived through the volatile decades of the 1970s and 1980s, the memories of regional conflict resurfaced instantly. Even the faintest suggestion of war, especially coming from a head of state, rippled through the collective psyche like an old wound reopening. Parents spoke quietly in their homes, watching the news with unease. Business owners checked supply chains. University students debated the meaning of Museveni's statement in late-night group chats. The tension was not uniform, but it was undeniable. Meanwhile, in Uganda, the political impact was just as significant. Museveni's supporters praised him for speaking boldly about Uganda's long-standing disadvantage as a landlocked nation. They framed his remarks as a call for regional fairness, a refusal to accept permanent dependency on Kenya's coastline. But his critics saw the statement differently. They argued it was reckless, designed to inflame emotions during campaign season rather than strengthen national interests. Many Ugandans, especially those living near the Kenyan border, worried that warlike rhetoric could damage the very trade routes their livelihoods depend on. Economically, the stakes were high. Uganda's imports and exports rely heavily on Mombasa port. Any disruption, even symbolic, could cause delays in fuel, food supplies, and essential goods. Kenyan businesses too rely on Uganda as one of their largest trading partners. In border regions, families are literally tied together across both nations by marriage, by commerce, by culture. When politics stirs tension, it is these communities that feel the tremors first. Politically, Kenya's government had to strike a delicate balance. By downplaying Museveni's comments as metaphorical, they attempted to calm the public and avoid escalation. Yet behind the scenes, security agencies remained alert. Kenya could not ignore the fact that a foreign military delegation had arrived on its soil at a moment of heightened sensitivity. Even if the visit had been planned long before, the timing made every movement, every meeting, every handshake subject to scrutiny. Uganda too faced internal contradictions. While the president invoked the possibility of future wars, his military, the Uganda People's Defense Forces, was actively deepening cooperation with Kenya at the very same moment. For many Ugandans, this raised questions. Was the president posturing for political gain, or was he signaling deeper frustrations his military alone could not express? For the broader East African public, the message was sobering. Words spoken carelessly by leaders can have consequences far beyond podiums and television studios. They can shake trade routes, unsettle border communities, and create political illusions that linger long after the microphones are turned off. Even if no tanks move, no troops mobilize, and no borders close, the psychological cost of tension, especially in a region with a fragile history, can be profound. In the end, the greatest impact was not measured in troop movements or official statements, but in the unease of ordinary people watching events unfold, wondering how far this moment would go and hoping that their leaders understood the weight of their words. From the perspective of Washington, the tension between Kenya and Uganda was not simply a neighborhood quarrel, it was a potential fault line running through one of America's most strategically significant regions in Africa. The United States has long viewed Kenya as a stable anchor in East Africa, a partner in counterterrorism, regional peacekeeping, and diplomatic outreach. Any suggestion of conflict involving Kenya, even rhetorical, immediately triggers concern in policy circles from the Pentagon to Foggy Bottom. For U.S. strategists, the most alarming aspect of Museveni's statement was not the threat itself but the timing. East Africa is currently navigating a complex web of pressures: Somalia's fragility, conflict in Sudan, instability in eastern Congo, and rising competition between global powers for influence in the region. Adding friction between Kenya and Uganda, two key American partners, is the kind of development Washington hopes to avoid at all costs. To Americans who track African geopolitics, the port of Mombasa is far more than a regional economic hub. It is a lifeline for humanitarian aid, a logistical gateway for U.S. military cooperation, and a key artery supporting operations against al-Shabaab in Somalia. Any sign that tensions could disrupt this port or complicate the movement of goods inland is instantly flagged as a risk to American interests. That is why Museveni's rhetoric suggesting future wars over access to the Indian Ocean raised red flags. While U.S. officials refrained from public criticism, privately they would be assessing whether these remarks signal shifting attitudes within Uganda's political establishment. The United States has worked for decades to maintain a predictable security environment in the region. Unpredictability, especially from veteran leaders, complicates long-term planning. The European Union took a more cautious tone but watched closely. Europe relies heavily on East African stability for migration control, trade corridors, and humanitarian access to conflict zones. Several EU diplomats expressed quiet concern that Museveni's comments could embolden nationalist rhetoric across the wider Great Lakes region, an area where borders, resources, and ethnic tensions have historically collided with devastating consequences. Within Africa itself, reactions varied, but shared a common thread: discomfort. Rwanda and South Sudan, both reliant on Kenya's ports, followed the unfolding story with keen interest. Tanzania, Uganda's historical rival in past conflicts, remained notably silent, perhaps recalling the scars of previous escalations. The African Union, though not issuing a public rebuke, likely monitored the situation through its Peace and Security Council, wary that such rhetoric could set dangerous precedents. For international observers, the real puzzle was not Museveni's words alone, but the juxtaposition of those words with Uganda's military delegation visiting Nairobi at the same time. To many diplomats and analysts, this signaled an internal contradiction. Uganda's political messaging leaned toward confrontation, while its military behavior continued to lean toward cooperation. Reconciling these two signals is difficult even for seasoned foreign policy experts. From a broader geopolitical standpoint, the situation underscored a truth the world often forgets: stability in East Africa depends as much on leaders' public language as on their military decisions. A single comment can shift markets, unsettle borders, or alter strategic calculations from Washington to Brussels to Addis Ababa. And so, while the United States and its allies publicly maintained a neutral tone, their internal assessments were crystal clear. This was a moment to watch closely, quietly, and continuously. In the end, this story leaves East Africa and the world with a sobering reminder. Sometimes the most dangerous moments are not marked by tanks crossing borders or missiles being launched. They are marked by words spoken casually, emotionally, or politically, yet carrying the power to unsettle nations. Museveni's statement about future wars over the ocean may have been metaphorical, exaggerated, or aimed solely at domestic voters. But even metaphorical threats can plant seeds of fear in a region where memories of conflict are still fresh. For many Kenyans and Ugandans, it was not the literal meaning that mattered. It was the possibility that such rhetoric could lead to misunderstanding, miscalculation, or unnecessary escalation. And the timing of the Ugandan military delegation's arrival in Nairobi only made the moment more complicated. Whether coincidental or intentional, their presence highlighted the delicate balance between cooperation and suspicion. Diplomacy sometimes happens across negotiating tables, but sometimes it happens in hallways, in handshakes, and in carefully choreographed visits meant to ensure everything remains stable on the surface, even when tensions swirl just beneath. East Africa today stands at a crossroads. Economies are intertwined, borders are porous, and millions of lives depend on the steady movement of goods, ideas, and people. A single phrase spoken by a president can reach far beyond television screens. It can influence markets, unsettle alliances, and shape regional perceptions for months. It is a responsibility leaders must carry with caution, especially at a time when the world is watching Africa more closely than ever. And as other African nations push towards sovereignty, stability, and unity, from reforms in the Sahel to economic independence efforts in places like Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré, the question grows louder. Will East Africa choose cooperation over confrontation? Because stability anywhere on the continent strengthens the whole, and instability spreads even faster. So I leave you with these questions. Do you believe Museveni's words were harmless political theater or the first sign of a deeper regional struggle? Should leaders be held accountable for rhetoric that shakes public confidence? And if you lived in Kenya or Uganda today, how would you feel, reassured or concerned? Your thoughts matter. Conversations like this help cut through the noise and bring clarity at a time when Africa's future is being shaped by bold ideas, sharp disagreements, and the pursuit of true sovereignty. If you believe that truth should always come before politics, please share this video. And if you feel you're among the few who truly want to understand the new era of Africa News leadership and change, especially the rise of leaders like Ibrahim, then subscribe. Your support helps bring the real stories forward.